Hey NSBC Church family, so this is part two of a sermon that began on the 12th of March, a couple of Sundays ago, in our final sermon in the series on shared life. We were thinking on that Sunday about shared possessions, and the big idea was share your devotion with generous living. The early church was so amazed by Jesus, so in love with him, they felt so united in their purpose, in their salvation that they had in him. Christ brought them unity. They prayed together in unity. They broke bread together in unity. They served God in unity. And they kind of thought, well, maybe our whole lives should reflect this. And so in response to Jesus, they lived lives of shared possessions. In other words, whatever was mine, I felt like it could be yours if you needed it. I wouldn't withhold anything from you, especially when it came to the needs of the poor. There was no welfare state, and so they dug deep to help the widows in their community, and it had a massive impact on the local community. So we thought about shared possession. Please do feel free to listen to that sermon if you haven't done so already. It's on our YouTube channel. But we've got a couple of other things flowing from that passage. One of them was shared connections, and the other was shared worship and witness. And we see these two themes in the passage. We'll very briefly look at those in a moment, but then I'd like us to get quite quickly onto the third idea of this evening's message at Growth Groups, which is more about shared vulnerability. And we don't see that word vulnerability here in the passage, but it's implied and it's definitely in existence throughout the New Testament, and we'll explore a little bit more about that in a moment. But firstly, shared connections. Not only did they share their possessions, they had an open attitude towards their possessions, they also shared their connections. It says in verse 46, day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in each other's homes. It's like they couldn't get enough of each other. Now, let's not think that they all gave up their jobs and that they all just hung around in this hippie commune kind of idea, just hanging out, hey man, yeah, cool, we don't have jobs to go to. No, it wasn't like that. In the early church, it was very clear. Some of them had to work really hard, especially slaves that were saved and wanted to be a part of the church community, but had to turn up late to every meeting. That's what we get in the sense of 1 Corinthians 11, that some were not waiting for others to arrive. They were eating beforehand. And Paul's like, come on, let's wait for our brothers and sisters who are working long hours. And so there was this shared connectivity in the early church, and we would love for that to be multiplied in NSBC. That's why Phil and I are excited by the idea of having something happening on most nights of the week at NSBC. What a great opportunity to have a vibrant church, which you may not be going to all those meetings. I hope you're not. You need to spend some time with your family or in other ways. But, you know, what a lovely thing to be busy about God and the things of him and sharing the gospel and making fellowship happen. And as a church to have the opportunity to do that is awesome. So let's be a church of shared connection, and obviously we're going to be preaching to the converted here because you're at Growth Group, but Growth Groups are just so vital in doing that. Our regular attendance at Growth Group means we can build these solid relationships with each other, help each other, encourage each other, and that can be then a springboard, a catalyst for us to connect with each other outside of Growth Groups, maybe one-to-one Bible studies, Bible read-throughs, praying for one another, praying in smaller groups. So great opportunities for connection. And then we also see worship and witness. So shared worship and witness. Verse 47, praising God and having favour with all the people. There's two ideas of worship and witness. As the early church were gathering around the word, having fellowship, praying, breaking bread, these love feasts that became well known and well slandered amongst some of the Gentiles, as they were seeing these signs and wonders being done, as people were being healed, people were speaking in a foreign language, and people going, whoa, never realized you spoke that language, and the person saying, neither did I, but God's Spirit's come upon me and I'm able to communicate to a guy from Phoenicia or a guy from Alexandria. And amazing things were happening in the church. And God's people were able to witness to the resurrection of Jesus. It spilled out of the church. The way they ministered to widows, I don't suppose, was just the widows of the church. It would have been largely the care of the widows in the church, but also those outside of the church. And the watching world had favour among them. They were unable to deny God's work in their lives. And I love what it says then. It says in verse 47, and the Lord added to the number day by day those who were being saved. Two things. Firstly, people were getting saved. As the church wasn't just internal in its witness or serving one another, it was external. It lived out of the abundance of Jesus. So the watching world were amazed, and on that day 3,000 souls were added, and then on another day another 4,000 were added. It's like people came to faith. They didn't know each other's names. There was no way that you could remember all those names in church life. So be encouraged if we're struggling to remember 100 people's names. The early church had to just get used to meeting people, not knowing their names, but serving with one another in home groups, in house to house, and they just loved Jesus together. And God was doing the adding. And that's the second thing. God was building his church. Notice the emphasis. Luke's very clear. The Lord added to their number. They didn't add to their number by clever means, by underhanded methods. They trusted God with the gospel, and he brought the increase. God knows those who are his. He knows those who will trust him. Leave it to him. Let's be faithful with the message, and let's share that message together and let him bring the increase. We cannot save people, but we can point them to the one who can. As we heard in a podcast at Growth Group Leadership Training a couple of weeks ago, share Jesus with them and then step out the way and let them see him clearly. So shared connections and shared worship and witness. And then finally, just want to spend some time thinking about this last one, which isn't in the passage, but I think it's worth spending the time on it, and that is shared vulnerability. Shared vulnerability. The word vulnerable doesn't appear in the New Testament. The word vulnerability isn't really a Bible word as such, but here's how it's defined: to be exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed either physically or emotionally. That's the Google definition of vulnerable. And that doesn't really capture the biblical ideal. And I'm still struggling to find a word that really does capture the Bible idea of this vulnerability. Vulnerability is the closest word we can come up with, but here's what I mean by vulnerability. It's different from just exposing yourself to risk. To be vulnerable in a biblical sense is this: to be so in love with Jesus that your defenses come down. You no longer hide those parts of your life that you once had brought you shame. Even though others may judge you, you humbly do this to show Jesus powerfully at work so his name is magnified. And I love that sense of idea that we're so in love with him, our defenses drop, and we openly testify of Jesus. Even if others judge us, we don't really care. It's like, this is my story. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not running anymore. And Jesus is glorified and others are helped to see him. And if that happens in church life, it's incredibly powerful. Look at how it happened in the New Testament. Let's just think of one or two examples. You might want to jot these down for discussion afterwards. There was the woman at the well. Jesus showed her her life. He revealed himself to her as the water that satisfies. And this is what her testimony was. Many Samaritans, in verse 39 of John 4, from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. And here's her testimony: he told me all that I ever did. What a great testimony. Jesus showed me my heart. He showed me what I was doing. He lifted the lid on my brokenness, and I want to tell you about him. She was vulnerable with her fellow Samaritans. Think of Zacchaeus. He showed a similar vulnerability. He was transformed by Jesus, and his open response was to reveal straight away he defrauded people. And he says, I'm going to give half of my goods away, and I'm also going to pay back 4 times those I defrauded. Now, it's quite possible that that ruined Zacchaeus financially, but he had a greater treasure. He had Jesus, and he perhaps went from being the most hated and most respected tax collector in, depending on where you're coming from, loved by his friends, hated by the rest of society, and he went from there perhaps being hated by everyone, but finding a place in Jesus's kingdom, loved by the flock of God, the family of God. I'd love to chat to Zacchaeus about his story one day. And the woman at the well, what did it look like to have your life impacted by Jesus? We get a sense of a snapshot. Well, time would fail us to tell us. Time would fail to tell us of the power of David's vulnerability. Through the Psalms, we see confession of sin. We see the struggles of feeling broken, weak, helpless, frightened, and how God ministered to him. We see Martha and how she felt safe enough with the Lord to say, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. She was very open and honest and raw in that moment, and was able to tell God how she felt, or Jesus how she felt. And we see the tender heart of Paul. He described to the Thessalonians, we not only shared the gospel with you, but our very lives. To the Corinthians, he wrote about having a wide open heart to them, how he struggled, how he felt weak. He opened up about his own vulnerabilities to help them understand the cost of the gospel and the reality that living for Jesus is hard, but his grace is sufficient for us. So we've got these examples of vulnerability in the Bible. And why? Why is vulnerability such a powerful tool? Well, in the hands of God, it scatters sin. When we're vulnerable and we create a culture of vulnerability in our church, when people are open, as we said earlier, they're so in love with Jesus that their defenses come down and they no longer hide their sin, they're no longer ashamed, it has a transformative effect on the community of God. Believe me, I've seen it in action over many years of pastoring. Sin is like a cockroach that scatters when you turn the light on. Sin wants to hide. Why do cockroaches scatter in the light? They know that they've been found out and they want to get away as quick as possible so they can breed some more. You know, there's a distinct difference between a cockroach and our cat. Now, let me explain. When I turn the light on in the lounge in the morning, we open the door a crack and open, and there is this beaming face and purring and lots of talking as he welcomes me and chats. Now, just to prove that I'm not making that up, I actually took a video the Sunday morning that I prepared this sermon. I took a video of our cat in the lounge, and I walked in the lounge first thing in the morning, and here's what I saw. Well, that video can't capture the smell of the litter tray, and quite honestly, the reality that when he licks himself, his breath smells. But he's not running in the dark. This cat feels safe and comfortable with us so that he can just be himself, and his face is beaming and he's purring all the way home as we welcome him in the morning. It's like, good morning, take me, I'm yours, with all his smells. You know, sin is like a cockroach, but when we have an open attitude towards God, we stand there, and whatever the smell, we stand before God and before God's family, and we just say, here's what I am, but God is changing me by his son Jesus. And we don't run away from the light. And so growth groups can be a great place where we just are accepted and we are able to open up as our growth group. One of our growth group big ideas is accepted, we open up. You know, I always get nervous when I meet someone who's just started coming to church and they share their faults of the previous church or church leaderships in the churches they've been to before. At that point, I start to get a bit twitchy, and I'm quick to say to them that actually, here are some of the flaws in my pastoring if you started attending this church. Here are some of the flaws in our church family as a whole. We're a bit laid back in places. We don't always arrive on time. If you're a real stickler for timekeeping, you'll probably be frustrated at our church. If you want everything done perfectly by the leadership team, I'm going to let you down within the first week. And it just helps to set the expectations. I don't plan on sinning, but the reality is that I get things wrong. And I have to promise to them that the one thing I can guarantee is that I'll be apologizing to them at some point if they hang around long enough at our church. We don't glorify sin. The reality is we are frail. And being in a community where we recognize our weaknesses, our bad habits, our things that we're not so strong at, that others can do much better than us, is a really safe place. It really emphasizes the value of the whole body and how much we need one another and how much more we need Jesus. And did you know that this vulnerability is a powerful testimony to the goodness of God, and science and sociology is now catching up with the wisdom of God. So tests have been done recently, research has been done, and books are now being written about the power of vulnerability. For example, Daniel Coyle, who's the author of a self-help book, The Culture Code, writes about something called the vulnerability loop. Someone will express a vulnerability, something that they're perhaps not so good at or that they feel a bit nervous about, and someone will spot that cue and offer up in return something of their own vulnerability, as if to assure them, I know how you feel. And once that trust is established, especially in a group, not just with individuals, but in a group setting, in a meeting, it can have a very powerful effect on the dynamics of that group. It's called the vulnerability loop. And God knew this ages before, when he knew man would fall, and he knew that one of the remedies in the church would be for us to share and confess our faults with one another, and in doing so it doesn't undermine the goodness of God or the power of the church, it strengthens it when we depend on one another as we depend on God. And one of the conversations we have after church can be really helpful in this regard, asking questions like, how are you? And that can be answered a couple of ways, and I get the reality that after church it can be really difficult to answer that question, particularly if you're on the edge, you're struggling with your emotions, and actually answering that question honestly would send you over the edge and into tears. That may not be a bad time, but that may be not the right time to express that. So there might be the courage to say, I can't really answer that fully right now. Life is tough. Would you just pray for me? Or you may say, thank you so much for asking. I wonder, could we maybe meet and chat about it? It may be that you can just give them a snapshot of what you're struggling with. It might be that you're doing really well and you can also rejoice with that person with something that's going well in your life. And so it's not always the things that we struggle with that have to be mentioned. It's okay not to be okay, and it's also okay to be okay. That is the rejoicing with those who rejoice, the weeping with those who weep. But sharing vulnerability can be a powerful thing. And growth groups can be a place of even deeper trust as we share vulnerability with one another. And I kind of encourage you, when you feel brave enough, to be open and share in your growth group. We had an example of that last week in our growth group that left us really tender towards the person who had shared, each of us knowing that it could easily have been us in that situation as they shared a struggle with sin, and their sharing did not undermine in any way their respect. It actually made us respect them in some ways a little bit more, because they were prepared to share and we were all with them in that moment in the room. So let's pray for one another, let's encourage one another, and let's confess our struggles to one another in the way that it seems appropriate for us. But let's know that sin likes to hide, but God wants us to walk towards the light, and this can be a wonderful way of defeating sin. Are you stuck in sin in an area of your life at the moment? Are you doing the same thing, repeating these patterns? Why not widen the circle of people that know and get people praying for you? Do you want to have victory in this area? Trust more people. Ask them to pray for you specifically. Gain the victory over these strongholds in our lives, that the Lord Jesus Christ may be honoured. And may the Lord help us as we increasingly share our vulnerabilities and walk with him. Well, there are a few things for us to think about in our growth group session now as we open up for a little bit of discussion.